All right, well, hello everybody. It's been 2 months since the last episode. I hope that you've been quietly anticipating the next conversation after the brilliant conversation we had last time. I am joined once again here with Pan and Krishna. Hey, you guys.
What's up? What's up?
Good to be with you guys here again. 2 months is way too long to be with you guys again.
Well, I'm very glad you feel that way. I feel like, particularly since the one in January when we started having these more democratically kind of structured episodes, it's gotten a lot more interesting than the extremely abstract nature of the first few episodes. So I'm glad that it's been very intensive.
Yeah,
true. But you need that foundation to really get into the nitty-gritty of these discussions.
Definitely, and I hope that with this one today, which I think is going to be the most interesting, at least special in my case, is going to be probably the last part of the foundation that we need to discuss some of the aspects in future episodes. So with that, I will introduce this by sharing my screen. Okay, let's see here. Where is that? There we go. All right, can you both see the screen?
Yep.
Yes, sir.
Okay, perfect. So, last time, if you all both remember, we had talked about this aspect called racial capitalism, and I know one of the things that kept eating at me in the past 2 months was, I know specifically Pan was wanting to get, towards the modern day, and he was wanting to try to see what the connections were between these type of economic systems and how they tie into modern day economics and capitalism in particular. And I had felt that with that episode last time, I had kind of structured it in a way where I was viewing mostly the history, power aspect, as I'll get into the differentiation here in a bit, but I didn't really go too much into how specifically the capitalism part of racial capitalism worked. It was more focused on the racial aspect of the racial capitalism. And for this episode, I actually want to go into the capitalism side of the entire structure. So I hope that I can kind of elucidate a lot more clearly how these various transformations of economic systems pretty much have stayed the same, just with a few superficial changes. So,
Interesting.
I don't know how this thing is not moving out of the middle. Okay, perfect.
Yep, there you go.
All right. So, as I just stated, the whole aspect with racial capitalism and how I'm wanting to go more into the capitalist aspect. But there was a few things that I did want to go over before, because I've been getting a few questions from people on my end who have been watching and listening to our podcast about how I kind of structure thought processes. And I think particularly in the future, as we start moving towards seeking solutions rather than explaining things, it'd be critical to be able to understand one, critical thinking, and two, metacognition, which are two very important aspects to any type of theorization. And so the first aspect that I always like to talk to my students about when I'm discussing these two things is critical thinking. Now, what do I mean by critical thinking? It seems like it's a very, common concept, but when you say critical thinking, very little do people actually question what that means. And critical thinking to me has always been questioning the underlying assumptions that other people find to be normative. Other people don't really want to question those types of assumptions. And usually this comes by way of this consciousness aspect that we talked about many episodes ago with Quiñones Rosado, in terms of recognizing patterns, understanding the historical context behind those patterns, and then trying to seek solutions to said patterns, much like what we've been doing with these past episodes since January. And there's three types of reasoning that usually go with critical thinking: deduction, induction, and abduction. And I'm sure that both of you are probably very familiar with deduction and induction. They're pretty very similar. Abduction's kind of a strange one that a lot of people don't study unless you've studied logic. But to try to make this a little bit more simple for other people who may be listening when this gets released and may not be familiar with these terms, these are pretty much ways that you can see patterns and try to restructure them in a way to make sense for yourself. So deduction is where you are basing it off of a particular theory or hypothesis, and based off of a particular observation that you're making, you deduce that the ending result of that is based off of how that theory has been postulated throughout history. So the example that I like to give to people is the town that my grandfather lived in, Duran, which Christian is very familiar with, just recently got grant money to fix up the gym. And so they've been laying down new pipes and creating, new plumbing and things of that nature. So imagine some of the people are digging up a hole and they're laying down the pipes. And because many of these guys that are doing this are their 50s, 60s, 70s, they're pretty tenured people in terms of knowing how to do this type of work. They understand that based off of a particular way, a particular method that they know is the most effective of laying down these pipes, they're going to dig into the ground and lay down these pipes based off of that very particular method that they know from doing it over and over and over again throughout their life. They have deduced from the particular method that they're used to that this way of doing the pipe laying is the most effective way of doing so. So starting from a method and using it to create a particular phenomenon. Now, induction, on the other hand, is where you are starting from the particular phenomenon and then inducing a particular theory from that phenomenon that you'll later deduce later on. So using the same example of the men who are laying down these pipes, say when they're back in their teens or 20s, when they were first learning how to do this, they didn't know how to deduce certain things because they didn't have the method or the various methods of understanding how to lay down these types of pipes. And so they had to learn through experience or through somebody teaching them that this was a particular way of doing so. And through actually doing it, they were able to induce the fact that this was the method that they were going to use for the rest of their life in terms of that particular field. And so induction, starting from the very particular and going to the very abstract, theoretical, hypothetical. Now, those are fairly easy to understand for the majority of individuals. Abduction is slightly different. This comes from Charles Sanders Peirce, who was an American pragmatist philosopher. And abduction, I like to think of it as you come upon an anomaly within the method that you're using, and you don't know how to explain why that anomaly popped up. So now it's your job to go out and explore and try to investigate how to fix that problem by understanding the causes that led to that particular problem. So once again, using the plumbing method or the plumbing anecdote, say that they're using the particular method that they've been used for however many times, but for some reason the pipe cracks or something of that nature, or the dirt caves in based off of how they dug it. The first thing they're going to try to think of is, okay, why did that happen where it's never happened before? And based off of how that happened, how can we explain the cause behind how that thing particular happened? And based off of trying to investigate the cause, that is where new methods and new theories come from. The other way I like to explain abduction is all of these police shows that people like to watch, like CSI, NCIS, Law and Order, Criminal Minds, etc., etc. All of those shows are simply nothing but abduction, because usually what you see is at the beginning of every episode, some type of crime has happened, and throughout the entire episode, it's the job of that particular federal bureau or unit to look at what the result of the crime was and try to trace back what happened through abduction to figure out what the grand scheme, the theory, the crime that happened, so they can convict the person who was actually committed said crime. So in the terms of what I'm trying to do for this particular discussion, every time I've come up to trying to create these episodes, what I always do when I'm reading or studying or researching things is I'm using particular theories that I've built up through my experience, and deducing certain aspects. And when that theory doesn't work, I use induction to try to figure out what may work and go back to a simple theory that I already know. But when deduction and induction don't necessarily work, then I have to start using abduction to create my own theories, my own lenses of understanding what's going on. And that is kind of what I was doing for this particular topic that we'll be discussing today. So before I move on to metacognition, does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah, the way that I was always taught it was that if the conclusion is certain, it's deduction, while if it's probable, it's induction, versus like best guesses is abduction. Is that kind of a layman's way of explaining that?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, the way I always explained it was like cause, effect, and then theory. But I've always found that to be slightly problematic because there's like various ways you can interpret it, but that would be probably the most straightforward way of seeing those three.
Yeah, I always like reviewing logic and the fundamentals of logic. It's always so interesting. But essentially, like, can you also think of it in like the sense that like deduction and induction are both already like they're kind of dependent on the existence of a theory, right? Like whether you are going from the theory to the observation or from the observation to the theory. Mm-hmm. Whereas like abduction is, would you consider that like the formation of an entirely new theory altogether?
Correct. It's a formation of a new theory based off of something out of deduction and induction not working.
Got it. Interesting.
An anomaly that appears, yeah. So then you have to go back and try to explain why the lenses that you've been using to analyze whatever phenomenon you're analyzing is not working for that particular phenomenon.
Okay.
So that's critical thinking. Metacognition is kind of a higher step of critical thinking, where critical thinking is one aspect. Okay, how do we question these underlying assumptions? Whereas metacognition is this aspect of thinking about your own thinking. Essentially, what you're doing with metacognition is the way that I'm viewing this particular topic the most effective way of doing this topic? It's questioning the theory itself and whether you should be using that theory to analyze the phenomenon. And the way that I like to explain this is using Karen Barad's agential realism philosophy. They are a non-binary philosopher. They used to be a quantum physicist, but then they went into physics, and they created a fascinating philosophy that's based off of material discursive practices, is the way that Barad discusses this. And what they mean by that is, if you understand this entire history of Michel Foucault, when he was discussing these aspects of history and how throughout history we build up these unconscious ideas of how knowledge is based, which he calls epistemes, and how these epistemes structure the way that everyday conversations happen within reality, you understand that these discourses that are constructed through discussion amongst one another have very, very real material effects on individuals. So much so that many of the discussions that we're even having now in modern day politics have material effects on the individuals who are at the receiving end of those particular conversations, especially with the things that are going on in like Florida and Texas and all of the other states right now. And so Foucault listed these unconscious type of ideas that we implicitly assume to be called epistemes. And he basically formulated this aspect of what he called biopower. And what he means by biopower is these types of discourses are structured in a way to be able to control the physical bodies of individuals. And the panopticon, which is a very famous term taken from Jeremy Bentham's philosophy, is this aspect of this surveillance upon somebody that they don't fully understand or know if somebody's actually surveilling them. But just by the fact that they feel that somebody is surveilling them, they control their actions in a way that adheres to the particular guidelines of how society expects them to act. And that is a term of biopower, a physical controlling of people's bodies. And Foucault splits this into two different ways, the dispositif and the appareil. And both of those two terms are French terms for apparatus. Now, the different ways that Foucault uses that is dispositif is particularly the discourses that happen that contribute to biopower. And appareil is the particular material surveillance mechanisms that are used, such as the panopticon, security cameras, police forces, things of that nature that control the bodies of people. And of course, the wider realm of this is what he calls biopolitics. Now, within Karen Barad's philosophy, what they're talking about in terms of agential realism is, as I explained, they used to be a quantum physicist before becoming a philosopher. And they were taking Niels Bohr's concept of the complementarity thesis. If you remember, I think it was the episode back in January when we were discussing the Nobel Prize aspect with the physicists that got the Nobel Prize, I had briefly mentioned Niels Bohr's complementarity thesis, this notion that if you look at the double slit experiment that proved wave-particle duality, Niels Bohr came to the conclusion that the interactions, the various, how the phenomenon interact within one another within this particular phenomenon that's being studied, is going to manifest differently depending on the particular observational apparatus that is being used. So depending on what tool the physicist is using to look at the particular phenomenon that they're studying is going to change based off of that very specific tool that they're using. So to extrapolate that specifically from the physicist realm, the physics realm, into what Barad is doing with their philosophy, Barad is pretty much looking at how we use all of these theories, which we can call observational apparatuses, to try to understand all this phenomenon when we're doing our critical thinking with the three different types of reasoning. But we have to question when we're doing metacognition whether the particular tool that we're using to analyze things is the most effective way of doing so, and how the particular phenomenon that we're analyzing, the particular patterns that may come up with one particular lens, may be a completely different pattern when we're using a completely different lens. And to understand how these various things that are entangled, because they say that all things in nature are entangled, it's when you put them together and specifically observe them through a particular observational apparatus, they're going to manifest in a particular way. And they call that diffractive methodology, this notion that not only what is being observed is itself telling of what we're trying to discuss, but the lens that we're using to analyze that phenomenon is also being analyzed within itself. The example that I like to give to this is, I think all of us are old enough here to remember CDs, and I hope most people who listen to this podcast will also remember CDs that kind of becoming obsolete. But if you remember when you would turn a CD around so its backside was showing, when light would hit a CD, it would diffract the light in a way where you could see the various color spectrum of the diffraction of light. Now, if you're thinking of the CD as a particular observational apparatus, then that observational apparatus is allowing you to see one particular pattern of how light can be diffracted. But that CD is not only giving you a sense of how to understand how light acts in that particular way, but the CD itself is also being observed because it's showing its own material aspects of how it can show that particular pattern that is happening. And so it's this kind of reciprocal relation where the phenomenon being discussed is not only the thing that is informing us, but we also need to be very cognitive and critical about the particular lens that we're using to view various phenomenon through. So does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Perfect. So using this aspect of critical thinking and metacognition, I had discussed at the beginning, I wanted to focus on the capitalist aspect more than the racial aspect. And the way that I want to do this is through analyzing the difference between power dynamics and class structure. I particularly think some of the biggest issues that we're dealing with right now is everybody is talking a lot about power, as we should be, because power is a very useful topic in many of the histories that we're dealing with. And in fact, everything that we've discussed up to this point in this podcast, from the first episode back in October till now, has been really about power, the history of power dynamics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the way I want to introduce this discussion is by two different stories that will converge when I'm going through this presentation. The first is dissidents versus fundamentalists. Any problem that has ever appeared in human history, we always know that there's people who are fundamentalists, meaning they're people who strictly adore that particular system, that particular structure, and they don't want any of that to change because it benefits them in a particular way. And we always know that there's always going to be people who critique that particular phenomenon, structure, history, whatever is being discussed. Now, within the aspect of capitalism, we know that capitalists, which are generally 1% of the population, the people who have accumulated the most wealth through that entire history that we talked about last time with racial capitalism, those are the fundamentalists. They adore capitalism. They don't want anything about capitalism to change because it has benefited them in the long run, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, when it comes to dissidents, when it comes to the story of capitalism, they've come in many different flavors, but the biggest one and the most challenged one here, particularly in the United States, has always been socialism, and it's kind of two other brothers or siblings, as I like to call it, communism and anarchism, which, because of the way that I will go into how the society has been structured here in the United States, oftentimes more than not have been drastically misunderstood because of the fear that has been indoctrinated into the American public with these particular terms. So what usually happens with any type of discourse is when you have a fractionation amongst dissidents, you'll usually have what we call reformers and revolutionaries. Reformers are the ones that you like to go to them and say, well, you know, not everything about this particular system is too bad, but there's certain things that are bad. So, you know, we need to get better working conditions. We need to get better wages. We need to get better this. You see this a lot with the trade union movements that are going on right now in the United States, where the unions are asking for things like better wages, better working conditions, more securities, better benefits, etc. The biggest problem that I've always seen with this, and I've discussed with the union at UNM about this on many occasions, is the dangers that comes with reform is it's always good to start slow. Like we discussed many episodes ago, you can't expect to change the entire system very quickly because it's not going to change. But at the same time, when you are only looking at very superficial elements and not fundamentally trying to change the structure, particularly when you're talking about something like capitalism, what usually happens is eventually the powers that be will give in and give you what you want, but because the powers that be in capitalism have a lot of wealth accumulation over the next decade or so, they can easily use their money to lobby politicians to pretty much redact or redo every single thing that the reformers fought for. Once again, because the reformers did not want to restructure the structure itself, they were only looking at very superficial elements of that. Reformers throughout history have been commonly looked at as being what we now call socialists. And there's very, problematic with that I'll get into later when I actually get into the definitions of those terms. Revolutionaries, on the other hand, are usually the ones that want to change the entire structure. They understand that these dynamics of reform are not going to always work, but they similarly also understand that they're not going to be accepted by the wider public, so they have to work somewhat in tandem with reformers to get those first few things done, with the hope that once those things have been achieved, they can then go and further their cause. The problem that's always happened with that, if we look at this history between dissidents and or the various fractionated variants of dissidents, is that usually what happens is that the powers that be are a lot more terrified of revolutionaries, so they go to the reformers and they say, listen, we're going to give you what you want, with the exception that you have to agree not to agree with those crazy people over there because they're wanting to go a little bit too far. So if we give you what you want, then you need to kind of work halfway with us and completely demolish those people so, we can kind of work together. And historically, what we've always seen when that happens is the reformers always usually give in if they get what they want, and then those reformers go and they kind of demonize the revolutionaries. And that's kind of historically have always happened throughout history. That's the dissidence versus fundamentalist storyline. The power versus class structure is very interesting because while they mutually inform one another, they're very, very different aspects. Power dynamics is kind of what we have been talking about up to this point. Racism, colonialism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, ageism, all these types of identity categories that have historically been oppressed have always been around this topic of who has the power over other people, who has the power to change certain things, and who has the power to do all of these other aspects that have contributed to these histories of subordination. I like to think of power as three separate aspects. One, who gets to create the rules? Two, who gets to enforce the rules? And three, when conflicts arise with the rules, who adjudicates those rules? So to give an example, since I've been teaching these past 2 years, I know because it's a law and I'm over the age of 18, that if I get frustrated with one of my students, I can't just go up to them and slap them across the face because, as we'll find with the second part, somebody's going to come in and probably arrest me. Now, the second part, on the off chance that the student doesn't get into a full-fledged fight with me for slapping them across the face, campus officer is probably going to come in and arrest me for assault and battery for attacking that particular student. So second, we have a person who's enforcing the power. And third, we need a particular process to adjudicate that particular power. So say that I come up with a story that I was in self-defense and that the student was trying to attack me first, so that's why I slapped the student. Well, now we need a particular court process to be able to adjudicate how that power is going to be distributed and who is going to be the beneficiaries of that particular power structure. You can map these three directly onto the three branches of the United States government. The legislative branch makes the laws, the rules. The executive branch enforces those rules, and the judicial branch are the ones that adjudicate said rules. And this is commonly how we've always seen power. And so there's that aspect. And I think we're all very familiar with the conversations that we've been having up to this point in this podcast with that aspect. Class structure, on the other hand, is something that sadly here in the United States, at least I've always found, has been very, very lacking in terms of discussion. I feel like other countries who've gone through socialist revolutions have a much more bigger grasp on class structure and class dynamics than a lot of Americans have because of how the education system has been shaped through this anti-communist, anti-socialist type of sentiment. And the way that I'm going to analyze class structure is going to be this entire episode, so I'll be getting into that. But understanding the difference between power and class really helps people to understand why we can have certain people who come from marginalized communities who will then go and marginalize or oppress people from their very own communities. I've been getting a lot of messages from people lately about things like, oh, well, Josh, if white supremacy exists, then how can something like what happened to Tyree Nichols in Tennessee happen, where you have 4 black officers who beat him to death? Or how can you have somebody like Clarence Thomas, who's in the Supreme Court and is facing his, crisis that's happening with his thing going on, abusing his power? Or Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice doing what they did? Or how white women tend to be the ones that are bombing abortion clinics? Like, how is it that these people who are usually at the receiving ends of the oppression are sometimes the ones that oppress their own communities? And if you don't understand the difference between power dynamics and class structure, that's really where this confusion comes from. W.E.B. Du Bois, the great African-American sociologist, came up with one definition, and the rest of this episode will give you the second definition. To give very, very briefly so we can get into the bulk of the episode, Du Bois came up with this notion of what he called the veil in his book called The Souls of Black Folk. And he said there's 2 different types of veils, the black veil and the white veil. He says the white veil is the veil that white people project onto black people. Now remember, he's just talking about anti-black racism, but later on in life he kind of extrapolates this to other issues as well. But for the purposes of our conversation with anti-black racism, the white veil are the projections that white people put onto black people. They cannot see the humanity that's behind that particular veil, and thus only see what they want to see within that particular veil. The black veil is the veil that black people have to live with, in which he has what they call double consciousness, in which black people always have to live with the fact of understanding themselves, but also understanding themselves through the eyes of how white people view them. So much so that it becomes this almost schizophrenic identity between the consciousness that African Americans have in society. And he splits double consciousness between three different aspects. One is the veil itself, which I just described. Two is two-ness. This is the double consciousness, viewing yourself through two different aspects. And three is second sight, this notion that people who come from oppressed groups have the ability, more so than people who are the oppressors, to be able to see potential solutions or potential future ways on how to get out of these particular systems of oppression. What's pertinent to the power versus class structure is Du Bois says that there's three ways that people who are on the receiving end of the veil usually respond to that. The first way is through self-assertion. This is usually where the oppressed group doesn't care what the dominant group thinks about them. All they care about is asserting themselves in a way where they feel better about themselves without having to be reliant on what anybody else views them through. This is kind of the way that Du Bois went for the rest of his life. The second way he sees people responding to the veil is through violence and insurrection. And as we talked about the Black radical tradition last time with Cedric Robinson, that's kind of where we get anarchism and various radical movements that try to destroy the entire structure itself rather than having to deal with the structure. But the third way, which is pertinent to the Clarence Thomas and the Tyree Nichols thing that I was discussing, was a lot of groups want to assimilate themselves to the dominant culture because they feel that by adhering to the dominant culture's demands, they can thus become like that dominant culture. And the saddest aspect, psychologically and sociologically speaking, is they finally come to the realization that that dominant culture is never going to accept them for who they are. And this assimilation process is one of the sociological ways, at least, that can explain a lot of that phenomenon of intra-racism, intra-sexism, and intra-insert type of oppression here. So before I get into the bulk of the presentation itself, does all that kind of make sense, how I'm kind of using this as a springboard to get into what I want to talk about?
Yes.
Okay. Krishna?
Yeah, I'm fascinated by it. Lots of questions, man. Let's keep going.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I was going to say, a lot of questions. There's a lot to unpack and all that, but yeah, continue.
No, and I do want, because this is going to be probably the most information-packed episode, which says something, because I know I've given a lot of information. But if you guys want to write things down so you can kind of remember what you wanted to ask, I'm completely fine with that, because like I said, there's going to be a lot of names, a lot of information here. So where I'm going with this to understand capitalism is Marxism. Now, this has kind of also been a dirty word that's been thrown around, kind of like socialism and communism. Their name shall go unmentioned, but I've had, particular family members that will come up to me and say, oh, what happened on January 6th, we can't let something like that happen or else this is going to become like a communist country. And when I hear discussions like that, it really jumps at me at the very lack of understanding that people have of those particular concepts. Once again, not through their own fault, but through the way that this society has been structured for people to be ignorant towards these particular issues. And Marx, when you really, really fundamentally understand Marx, he really has probably the most thoroughly understood and developed critique of capitalism. Marx very, very seldomly talked about communism. There's about 2 or 3 different times in all of the books that he writes where he actually talks about communism. Marx did nothing but provide a very, very brilliant critique of capitalism. And that's kind of what I want to use this episode to talk about, so we can get into this aspect of class structure versus power dynamics. I always tell my students, and I learned this by teaching, is that when you get to a certain level in whatever discipline or specialty you get in, you kind of forget, or you start to assume that maybe some of the fundamental basic aspects that you maybe thought you understood, sometimes good to go back and kind of relearn those things. And I know particularly for you two guys who, you've started a company, it would be very probably prudent on my part to understand that you both probably understand a lot of things about economics. It's always a good thing maybe to go back to the basics and kind of parse out some of those things, because there's always something beneficial there. And I think using Marx as this kind of linchpin of understanding class really helps us into really, really digging into how all of this is structured. So to kind of start another long durée thing, a historical aspect, if we look at the anthropological record, particularly this book called The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wingrove, we used to have this thought that, all of a sudden around the years 6000 to 4000 BCE, all of these civilizations popped up: the Indus Valley civilization, China, Mesoamerica, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and these were like the first really brilliant civilizations that started all of these aspects. And now that anthropologists are really digging farther and farther, and they're finding that there were a lot of interestingly structured societies prior to those, but they kind of undulated between higher levels of structure, higher levels of egalitarianism, back to higher levels of structure, back to higher levels of egalitarianism. It was not so clear-cut as the story has always been with these civilizations that have popped up. But one of the aspects that have always been discussed is, how do we get to the current aspect of how we call economics being theories of surplus value? And the notion has to really do with how climate happened. I always ask my students, why is it that we always ask the question, why was it that the British colonized the Aborigines in Australia? And why do we never ask the question, why wasn't the Aborigines that colonized the English? We never turn the tables, and oftentimes it's very uncomfortable for people to turn those tables. And usually when you do ask that question, people will resort to things like biological determinism, saying things like, the Aborigines were not technologically advanced as the British, which is true. I'm not saying that that's not true, but the intentionality behind that is more deterministic rather than anthropological. Another thing people will say is, the Aborigines were just inherently more kinder than the English. Ascribing kind of like these biological determinisms to groups of people, even if they are, well-intentioned, still contribute to that history of biological determinism. The simple fact that anthropologists have been able to see is it has a lot to do with how the climate functioned in a lot of these societies. If you look at the way that Eurasia is structured on a map, going all the way from Spain to Hong Kong, all of that is one long horizontal strip. There's a few bumps here when you get to like Turkey and, all these other places, but relatively it's about one long straight line. If you look at the climate zone between those, it's pretty much almost the same climate in all of those regions with some very basic distinctions in certain parts. That makes it, one, a lot easier for trade to happen because spices and things wouldn't have spoiled so easily if there was so many different climate variations. And it also shows how certain societies were going to have to develop tools, develop methods of cultivation in order to develop surpluses. Whereas if you look at aspects like Africa, for instance, which is more vertical than horizontal, you have a much wider range of climate variations that necessitated different ways of societies to structure the way that they structured. Same thing with the Aborigines. The point being that certain societies, based off of the climate regions that they were at, were able to sustain themselves on the basic bare line necessities that they needed from the particular countries that they were at. They didn't have to develop cultivation in order to build up surpluses until much later, whereas other societies had to build up surpluses in order to create sustenance. And based off of that sustenance, They started developing higher levels of technology, tools, soon gunpowder for fireworks, and then eventually guns, those types of aspects. And what we now see as surplus is really the formation of what we see as being the modern day economy when we really think about economics. When you start getting surplus and distributions of surplus, you have to start developing writing systems, because as we discussed last time, if there's credit involved, you have to have some type of way of documenting who owes who what. So you have to develop writing systems to do this. You now have to develop money as a third party of assuaging the exchange values that are going on in society. Credit and debt, as I just explained, who gets to credit, who has the debt, how do we keep track of that? The state gets involved, because how do we have any security of getting our debts back if we've credited certain things, unless we have some type of entity that is going to either, one, come in and adjudicate based off of if somebody doesn't want to pay back the debt, or two, give us our debt out of their own treasury or whatever is developed in order to secure our finances. Religion, this is very fascinating. Karl Jaspers has this theory that religion started when these civilizations and economies started, because what began to happen in these early societies is that the distribution of the surplus began being allocated unequally. And in order to justify the unequal distribution of that surplus, things like religion started becoming developed in order to kind of tell these people, you know, it's horrible what you're going through right now. And yes, it is unfair, but if you work this particular way, you stay this particular way, then you will have this afterlife that you can live in next to insert deity or spiritual person here that you worship. And you will live happily ever after in the afterlife, if there is an eschatological schemata in the particular religion that we're talking about. And then finally, something that a lot of people don't think about too with the whole colonial thing is biological and physical warfare. One of the biggest things that was gathered as surplus in the early societies was granaries, where grain was stored. As you started getting these societies that had more and more bigger populations, you have grain that's being stored. You have people moving back and forth, animals moving back and forth. Lots of bacteria is going to start accumulating. And of course, we forget that during this time, a lot of the European population died from the diseases because they had not become immune to that bacteria that had been forming in these granaries and these huge cities. But as centuries went by, they did become immune to that. And we often forget that because they had become immune to it, when they did come over and start colonizing the territories, those type of bacteria then got transferred to the indigenous communities and completely decimated those communities because they were not familiar with that particular bacteria. Once again, because these particular societies may not have had to contribute or create surplus due to the various climatological regions that they had lived in. And so all of that and that second bullet point is really on the anthropological record where we start seeing these various systems starting to accumulate. So before I actually get into Marx and how Marx fits into this, did that kind of all make sense?
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think we all know about the history of gun, germs, and steel, and how that helped civilizations advance. But I didn't know that about the grain specifically, so it's very interesting to hear about that.
Yes, it's, you always hear this when we're talking about history, and it's like, oh, well, the vast majority of the indigenous people died from diseases. It wasn't like from physical warfare, and we hear that over and over again, and we have that understanding, but it's never really fully explained as to how that occurred and why there were certain germs in Europe compared to germs in other parts of the world.
Yeah, it's interesting because we always assume that it comes from like human to human, but grain, like the spread through grain and what you were talking about, is that's something very interesting that's not actually been brought up in my history of learning.
Mm-hmm. Yes. What's fascinating is what goes hand in hand with this conversation is democracy at the same time, and that's a very, very loaded word. This aspect of what do we even mean by democracy? We have a representational democracy here in the United States where we pick a particular representative to represent us. But when you analyze the history of democracy, it's a very, very different concept. People like Aristotle and Plato did not like democracy because they saw the dangers with certain aspects of democracy. But democracy in its purest sense and this is where Pan, you're going to get excited again because I'm going to be introducing the origination of the word here, like I did last time. But when they used to discuss in the Agoria in ancient Greece, there was two concepts of democracy. The first one was called isagoria, and the second one was called parrhesia. Isagoria was the concept of anybody with any type of rational stance would come up, and their stance, their viewpoint had to be upon equal merit with anybody else's viewpoint. It didn't matter how radical it was, how inane or ignorant it could be. Everybody's voice had to be contributed to that particular discourse. And they even went towards particular steps on preventing people who may have been more rhetorically efficient than others in being able to overtake other people who may not have been more rhetorically efficient, such as the sophists, like we described in the first episode, and the problem with them. And so that was isagoria, and parrhesia was the notion that you could say whatever you wanted to say in these places without the fear of being retaliated against. And in many aspects, when we talk about liberalism and conservatism and all this aspect that I'm about to get to in the next bullet point, a lot of times we have lost that aspect of democracy. And going back to how they would particularly discipline people who were more rhetorically efficient, if somebody was being too bright in their thinking, or they weren't letting other ideas kind of flow in that system, what they would do is that they would send them out of the Agoria, and they would get what was called an Ostricho Shell, which is this crustacean type of fish that grows out there or lives out there rather in Greece, and they would write their name on the shell, and when they got out of timeout, so to speak, then they would give the shell back to the person. This Ostricho Shell is where we get the term ostracism from. So there's a little interesting historical footnote.
So do we have a shell for Josh? We can write his name, send him away for a little bit so we can contribute. He shines too bright. He's shining too bright for us right now.
Anyway, so all these different stories are kind of accumulated, and I'm trying to create the road that we're going to go down with all these kind of side roads that have been accumulating up to this point. And really, I want to get to Karl Marx. So a little bit about Marx before I get to Marx's theory. Marx was born in 1818. He dies in 1883. He was Austrian, but he was mostly in the German Empire, because if you remember, the unification of Germany was happening during this time with Otto von Bismarck and the various Prussian wars and everything that was happening during the time. And there was this long history of what was called utopian socialism that was happening prior to when Marx came. Utopian socialism started roughly around the 1750s. These were people who were really starting when capitalism, the very, very proto-capitalism, was beginning to start in the Industrial Revolution, really looking at the downsides of how capitalism was exploiting individuals and wanting to change the way the system worked. The big problem, why it was called utopian socialism, is going back to this reform versus revolutionary fight that has always happened. A lot of the utopians were reformers rather than revolutionaries. They saw certain superficial elements that were wrong with it, but they didn't really want to change the structure that was going on, and didn't really. They had interesting ideas, but not too interesting ideas. People within the utopian socialist movement were individuals like Henri de Saint-Simon, Robert Owen, who actually had his own socialist factory where he actually paid higher wages to his workers. A very interesting figure. I highly suggest looking him up, Robert Owen. And then we had Charles Fourier, Babeuf, who was a German, Louis Blanc, Louis Blanqui, and there was many, many, many others. But they were critiquing capitalism at a very, very superficial level. Now, this got contrasted by the time Marx and Engels are around, and they're seeing all the devastation that's happening with what they called scientific socialism. Marx and Engels found, or thought rather, that these officials were too idealistic in their thinking, hence utopian versus scientific. Marx wanted to look at the very, very material conditions of what was actually happening and use that as his galvanizing point to build his theory from. And that's really what separates the way that we think of socialism now from the way that these early figures began to think of socialism. What was also happening during this time was the beginning of the anarchism movement. Anarchism roughly starts at the end of the French Revolution in 1789. If you know the Third Estate, which was the peasants in France take over and kill King Louis. And then for a while there's this sociopathic reign of terror by Maximilien Robespierre, where he's guillotining literally everybody. And then he gets taken out by Napoleon, and the whole invasion stuff with Napoleon happens until he's taken out. But what was happening during the French Revolution was a lot of people were beginning to question these systems of oppression, these systems of power. And what they viewed this as being was, we're going from this old system of oppression called feudalism, where our rights are being trampled on and all this stuff. And through capitalism, we're going to find higher and higher levels of freedom. This is power dynamics, not class structure. They're only looking at who has the power, because remember, the hands of power had changed from the kings to the Third Estate. So they thought, oh, if we just change who's in power, everything's going to get better for everybody. As we know from the history that we're living right now, that did not happen. So a bunch of group of people got together who later became anarchists. The most interesting one during this time is William Godwin. He was married to Mary Wollstonecraft, who was considered one of the first feminists, and their daughter was Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. She was married to Percy Bysshe Shelley, the great romantic poet, but that's beside the point. But these people started looking at aspects like the state is having too much power over people. We don't want all these people to have power. And they started questioning the state and the power that was invested in people who had said power. Another big one during this time was the Marquis de Sade. This is where we get the term sadism or sadistic from. The Marquis de Sade was a moral philosopher who wrote books on extremely perverse subjects of sexuality. And he has this one book called Les philosophies dans le boudoir, which is French for the philosophy of the bedroom, where he basically talks about this concept of free love, which was a big anarchist concept, and is very relevant today with the anti-LGBTQ plus bills that are happening. The Marquis de Sade was pretty much looking at how insane it is for a state to be able to tell you, one, who you should be able to love, and two, who you can have sex with in your own private residency. And through this notion of free love philosophy, which is one of the moral philosophies, they begin questioning him, and Godwin and Wollstonecraft begin questioning all of these aspects. As Godwin kind of went on and this kind of structure of anarchism started going, we started getting people like Max Stirner, who was a very big egoist anarchist, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who had his theory of property and anarchism, Mikhail Bakunin, who was probably the most famous anarchist, and then, of course, Kropotkin, Peter Kropotkin, who's my favorite anarchist, who has the concept of mutual aid. And so during this entire time, you have all of these different discourses about the state and capitalism and economics and power dynamics and class structure happening. And Marx and Engels are kind of just tied up in all of these discussions. And one of the last big ones before we get to Marx himself is this concept of classical liberalism. This is devised by people like Wilhelm von Humboldt, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Hobbes, John Stuart Mill, who created utilitarianism, and this notion of natural rights, private property, individualism, self-reliance, this aspect that everybody should be able to be their own person, and that no state should be able to trample on one person within reasonable limits. Now, during the episode that I did in January, when I had complexified this dichotomy between Republicans and Democrats, and I had showed how this party switch had happened and using these type of names is kind of useless in modern day politics, and I had used liberal versus conservative as a placeholder for Republican and Democrat. Well, for this, I want to complexify liberalism and conservatism, because the way that I've always viewed it, and I think it's becoming more pertinent in modern day politics, is I've never really viewed liberalism and conservatism as being two diametric opposites of a spectrum. I've always viewed it as being a circle that mutually informs one another. And this is the reason why. When you look at the people who were talking about classical liberalism during the 16, 17, and 1800s, there was only one particular person that they had in mind who should have been the liberal individual subject with all of the rights afforded to them. That was the white man and all the other identity categories that go with that. And in order for that white man to have the privileges afforded to them, they needed to exploit other people. So liberalism has only been possible for certain groups of people through the non-liberalism of other groups of people. That's my biggest problem with classical liberalism and almost how we discover liberalism as being kind of overabused in progressive discourses today. Where conservatism comes in is where the liberal person has now gained the accumulative advantages and wealth accumulation that they've got through the liberalism, and now the conservatism comes in when they do not want to relinquish those particular resources that they've developed. And so I've always viewed this superficial dichotomy between the two as actually being, like I said, a long road or circle that kind of mutually informs one another. And Marx was very much within that same critique of that. So before we get to Marx proper, because the social kind of historical context makes sense behind what Marx was looking at?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Now we get to the juicy part. So like I said, Marx, really all he did was critique capitalism, and he did it very, very brilliantly. So kind of going back to the anthropological record, if we're talking about surplus and how surplus was developed, we know that every human society has always had to have certain groups of people go out and work. Whatever that work is, it was some type of work in order to produce a surplus of something that then needed to get distributed to the rest of the community, both the people who were working and the people who were not working to create that surplus. Now, the total amount of people who create that surplus, the total amount of work, human work, is what Marx called abstract labor. And the particular work that was done, say the goldsmith was over here and the hunter was over here, whatever those particular functions were, is what he called concrete labor. And he differentiated between the two because he said when capitalists try to come up with the value, the price of the particular commodity that they're creating, they don't look at concrete labor, they look at abstract labor. Because if you looked at concrete labor, if it took 5 hours for a toy to be made and it took 5 hours for an iPhone to be made, then technically if you're using that particular theory, then the toy and the iPhone should equal the same amount when it's on the exchange value and price in the market. But obviously that's not true. So if you take the total human work that is involved in that in all sectors of the population, that is where Marx says the price of particular exchanges come from. But Marx was much more interested in how it's produced, who appropriates that production, and furthermore, how that surplus is distributed. That is all Karl Marx was. It's a lot more complex than that, and I'm going to get into that, but remember the baseline is who's producing the surplus, who's appropriating the surplus, and who is distributing the surplus, and who's the receiving end of that distribution. Production happens, he calls it embodied labor plus lived labor equals total labor. Embodied labor are the tools that are the means of production is what he calls it, but these are just simply the tools that are used in the production of whatever commodities are being made in that particular company, corporation, store, whatever we're talking about. And the embodied labor is the labor of the people who created those tools prior to the person purchasing those tools as private property for the means of the production of the commodity within that workplace. So if you are in a particular store and you're having to cut up watermelons, the blade that you're using to cut the watermelons and then the saran wrap that you're using to, wrap it up and put the price tag on so you can put it out in the store for somebody to buy, that saran wrap in that tool was made in a completely separate production process, and the embodied labor are those workers who put their labor into those tools to create what is now being created in this separate workplace. The lived labor, on the other hand, is the actual work of the person who is using that tool. So the worker who is using the knife to cut the watermelon and using the saran wrap to wrap the watermelon up, that's the lived labor that is put into that particular commodity, which is the watermelon. And those combined equal the total labor, which is the amount of labor that gets put into that product. Now, what Marx calls exploitation, and we use that term a lot, but the way that he uses exploitation is when you get hired by a particular worker, you are never going to get paid the amount of labor that you put into that particular commodity. Say, just for simple example, it was 100, let's say, dollars went into embodied labor and $100 went to lived labor for a total of $200. When the capitalist goes to sell that, or they sell it and they get the money back, and they're wanting to look at that surplus of money that they've gotten from that, Marx says they're going to have to put part of it back into the means of production, meaning they're going to need to buy more tools because the tools have been used up in the production process. So that's where half of some of the surplus goes. Another part of the surplus goes to actually paying the worker, the employee who's doing the work for them. But there has to be a disproportionate amount that is paid as wage to the particular worker, or salary if you're in a corporation, that is significantly less than the surplus that is being created. Meaning, I always laugh when people, and my mother, when she listens to this later, is going to laugh because she's going to know who I'm talking about when I say this, but people who say, I'm going to go into a corporation that pays me what I'm worth because I'm worth more than what I'm being paid right now, is never going to happen in capitalism, because if the capitalist pays you for what you're worth, they're not going to get anything out of it. They need to pay you a lower wage than the surplus that they're getting in order for them to make the surplus that they need. That gap between how much the worker is being paid and how much the capitalist is actually getting out of that surplus is what Marx calls exploitation. Marx differentiates between productive and unproductive workers. The productive workers are the people who are actually in the actual assembly line producing the things that are going to be put on the marketplace. And the unproductive workers are people like managers, security, people who don't necessarily contribute to the production process, but through their actions help to secure that process, help it not to fall apart. And so that distinction is very, very important, particularly when we get to concepts later. He talks about 5 different ways of how the surplus can be distributed. So if you remember, he's interested in the production of surplus, who appropriates that surplus, and how that surplus is distributed. The first way he says is, person works for themselves. This is what he calls the ancient mode of distribution, what we now call self-proprietorship or entrepreneurship. A person works for themselves, they make their own surplus, and then they get to appropriate their own surplus and distribute it based off of their own means. That's one way that Marx sees it happening. The second way he sees it happening is the people who produce the surplus collectively get together and appropriate said surplus and collectively vote and decide on who gets that surplus. That is what's called communism. Literally, that is what communism is. When I get later with these faux notions that have been built about communism and how people think what happened in certain countries was actually communism, what actually wasn't communism, that'll make more sense. But that's literally what communism means to Marx. The workers produce together, they appropriate together, and they distribute equally amongst one another. Slavery, you've got the slaves that are producing, the master appropriates the surplus from the slave, and then they distribute it amongst entities to perpetuate that system of slavery, whether that's through the courts, writing new laws that perpetuate the institution of chattel slavery, whether that's through slave patrols who monitor whether runaway slaves are going through. However they distribute that is going to be up to the slave master. Feudalism, the serfs are producing the surplus, the lord is appropriating that surplus, and they're distributed amongst other things that are going to perpetuate the system of feudalism. Whether that's the Catholic Church that's going to teach the serfs that, once again, if you go through this now, you're going to live a better afterlife, whether that's through the knights who are going to be patrolling the fiefdoms. All of that distribution is specifically designed to keep the system going. And then finally, capitalism. The employees are producing a surplus. The board of directors are appropriating that surplus, and then amongst them, they decide how they're going to distribute that surplus. So at the beginning, when I had said last time, I didn't really go into how these systems have kind of perpetuated. They haven't really changed except on a superficial basis. This is what I meant. Feudalism, slavery, and capitalism seen through the strict Marxist analysis of class structure really has not changed much. The power dynamics have changed, but the class structure has not changed very, very much. So does that make sense so far?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So Das Kapital, Volume 1. This is Marx's most famous book on class analysis. This is where he goes into how do we differentiate between a commodity versus a good. A commodity is a specific thing that is sold as for exchange value on a particular market. You create something, you put it in a market, and it gets exchanged for something else. And based off of that reciprocal exchange, it is a commodity that is sold. A good, on the other hand, is something that is exchanged without reciprocity. So I'll use an example of the same item to show how in a particular context it can be a commodity, and in a completely different context it can be a good. Say it's your cousin's birthday party, or let's use a different one. Say it's your mother's birthday party and you want to get her a gift. So you buy her some flowers just as an introductory gift, and you go to the flower shop and you buy the flowers for however much they're on the market. When you trade the money for those flowers, that flower, that bouquet that you get is a commodity because it's being exchanged for a particular thing. In our case, this is cash that's being exchanged for. You go back home and you give that to your mother as a gift. When you exchange that to your mother as a gift, you're not expecting her to reciprocate with something because it's supposed to be a gift. That's the meaning of a gift, non-reciprocation. When that is being exchanged as a gift, that is now a good, not a commodity. So that is how Marx differentiates between those two. He also says the biggest problem with capitalism is that what used to be experiential value has now been turned into exchange value in every sector of humanity. What he means by experiential value is, and I'll use an example for this. Imagine you've got done eating Thanksgiving at a dinner table, and you know how much dishes accumulate when you have Thanksgiving, and your father or one of your parents say, hey, Krishna, let's use you for an example, can you help us gather all this and wash the dishes for us, because it's going to be really, really difficult. Now, generally, because you're a family member, you're not really expecting some type of exchange value to happen between that. Most people in that situation are going to be like, sure, dad, sure, mom, sure, bro, whatever, I'll go help you out, and that's going to be an equal exchange amongst us. That's experiential value. You're doing it out of your own humanity. You're not expecting anything in return. But imagine if that person said, that'll be $5, Dad, if you want me to wash the dishes. Well, now you've turned that into exchange value rather than experiential value. And Marx's critique was, with the constant expansion of markets into every facet of humanity, we are now turning things that should be experiential value into exchange value. Particularly things that should never have been, like prostitution, is literally turning the idea and the aspect of the actual physical act of sex into an exchange value. Or other aspects of the society that are being turned into exchange values is what he calls the de-reification of the world. Everything only has price rather than value, is how he differentiates between those two terms. When it comes to exchange, he sees that there's three different ways that this has happened throughout society. C to C, this is commodity for commodity. That is just a mathematical formula for showcasing barter exchange. That's pretty straightforward. You exchange something for a commodity for another commodity. CMC, you are exchanging a commodity for money that you then use that money to go buy yourself another commodity. That has kind of been the way that a lot of us has seen a lot of exchange happen. But Marx was very much more interested in what he called MCM. This is where you're using money that has already been created to buy a commodity to get more money. And he says this is the way that capitalism works. You have a capitalist that is using amount of money to buy the means of production. Those are the commodities, the tools that are going to be used as a way of making more money. You are using capital in the hopes of getting more capital, hence capitalism. That's why it's called capitalism. And he differentiates between three different types of capitalists: industrial, merchant, and money-lending capitalists. The industrial capitalists are the factories. This is where the actual physical production of goods that are then going to be transported through the various transport mechanisms to other stores is actually created. In the modern day, we've become desensitized to industrial capitalism because a lot of the industrial capitalists has been exported to other countries, particularly China. So we don't really see too much of the actual physical production of commodities in this country anymore like we used to in the older days. The merchant capitalist is what we're mostly familiar with as citizens of the United States. These are the people who are receiving those commodities that have been produced in those industrial factories through transportation mechanisms that then sell those commodities in their own stores for a particular value. And those are the merchant capitalists. Central to Marx's critique are the money-lending capitalists, the bankers, because he says these are the ones that are actually creating the money for a lot of the capitalists. The question when you're looking at the MCM is, well, where does the capitalist get the first M to begin with? How are they getting the M to start this process? That happens in two different ways. One, the shareholders either invest into the company for you to start the company, or two, you pull out a business loan from the bank that you then have to pay back with interest in order to start your own company. And that's where the money-lending capitalists come from. When you look at the history of feudalism, particularly in medieval Europe, the money-lending capitalists during this time tended to be the Jews in Europe. And during this time, particularly in feudalism, political power and economic power were not tantamount to one another. The lords and the monarchy had all of the political power, but the economic power did not have political power. So when you started seeing merchants who started going across the ocean, trading spices, trading human beings, and colonizing further territories, a lot of the Jewish merchants started accumulating more and more money. And of course, the powers that be, the monarchies and the lords and all of them, didn't like this. And so you start seeing some of the early forms of the money stereotype of anti-Semitism starting to be formed during this time, where the political power was being challenged by the economic power of the money-lending capitalists.